All right, let's dive right into this explainer. We're looking at a classic, incredibly high-stakes standoff, straight from the ancient texts. Picture this, a seemingly impossible task, a terrifyingly formidable enemy named Jarasandha, and an entire kingdom's fate just hanging in the balance. Today, we're unpacking a really tense dialogue between two brothers, standing right on the precipice of a monumental decision.
And that actually brings us to the core question we really need to unpack today. When you're facing certain destruction, is it better to retreat or do you stand and fight? This dilemma pulls us straight into the dramatic tension between self-preservation and supreme duty. So the brothers here are contemplating the great Rajasuya sacrifice, which is this hugely ambitious step toward imperial dignity. But standing right in their way is a threat so immense that taking action, well, it might just mean their total annihilation.
So, let's get into Section 1, A Kingdom's Great Dilemma.
Which leads us to Section 2, Yudhishthira's plea for caution. Now, to really understand this conflict, we first have to recognize the absolutely paralyzing fear gripping King Yudhishthira. I mean, he's looking at an enemy so fierce that even Yama himself, literally the Lord of Death, couldn't vanquish him. Feeling this crushing burden of responsibility for the people he loves most, Yudhishthira reveals some profound vulnerability. He actually says, "Both Bhima and Arjuna I regard as my eyes, and thee, O Janardana, as my mind." By relying so heavily on his brothers as his vision and Krishna as his intellect, it breeds this deeply relatable hesitation. He essentially asks, how shall I even live, deprived of my eyes and mind? It's a beautiful sentiment, right? But it makes you wonder, does this immense love and attachment actually cloud a leader's ability to take necessary risks?
Well, Yudhishthira reaches a pretty firm conclusion based on that fear. He basically states that the proposed task promises to lead to great mischief. In his mind, his heart is afflicted, the sacrifice just appears way too difficult, and therefore simply desisting from this act is the only beneficial path forward. He argues that acting from selfish motives just for imperial dignity, especially while relying purely on courage against a seemingly impossible enemy, is, well, a guaranteed recipe for tragedy.
All right, shifting gears to Section 3, Arjuna's philosophy of valor.
Suddenly, the energy here completely shifts. Arjuna steps up to counter this argument, and his confidence is just absolutely magnetic. Remember, he's fueled by his newly acquired invincible weapons and this magnificent chariot. With that newfound strength, he injects a resolute, totally uncompromising call to action right into the debate. He lays out this highly meritocratic worldview through a really direct comparison. He acknowledges that, sure, learned men praise nobleness of descent, but to him, a person of high birth who lacks valor is scarcely worthy of regard. On the flip side, someone born into a race not really noted for valor but who actually possesses it is far superior. He completely rejects the idea that noble descent means anything at all without the sheer prowess and action to actually back it up.
You see, for Arjuna, action strictly defines character. He argues that a Kshatriya, a warrior, increases his fame and possessions specifically by the subjugation of his enemies. And he takes it a step further, claiming that someone possessing valor, even if they're literally destitute of every other merit, will still vanquish their foes. Meanwhile, someone who has every other merit in the book, but lacks valor, they can scarcely accomplish a thing. Valor to Arjuna is the absolute foundational virtue where all other merits exist.
Let's move on to Section 4, the mechanics of victory. Now, Arjuna isn't just preaching some blind, reckless charge into battle. Instead, he introduces a super practical, incredibly modern-feeling strategic framework for actual success. He believes ultimate victory requires this highly specific three-part formula. 1. Concentration of attention. 2. Exertion. And 3. Destiny. Basically, even someone who has extreme valor doesn't really deserve success if they act carelessly. He makes it crystal clear that courage has to be laser-focused through intense concentration and relentless effort if it's ever going to align with destiny.
And he highlights this brilliant universal truth to back it all up. As meanness overtakes the weak, so folly sometimes overtakes the strong. I mean, think about how true that is. He warns that an enemy endued with massive strength sometimes suffers death specifically because of carelessness. A king who actually wants victory has to actively avoid these causes of destruction. You can be the absolute strongest person in the room, but if you act with folly and lose your concentration, you're going to fall.
Then Arjuna brilliantly grounds all this abstract philosophy right back into their immediate, high-stakes reality. What is the actual ultimate goal of all their exertion? It isn't just selfish ambition. No, it's slaying Jarasandha to rescue the captive kings being kept by him for a really cruel purpose. By framing it this way, Arjuna totally shifts the narrative. Fighting isn't just about risk anymore, it is quite literally the absolute highest act they could possibly employ themselves in.
This brings us to a massively powerful reframing of risk. Arjuna basically tells Yudhishthira, look, we certainly have the competence here. Why regard us as incompetent? He argues that if they sit back and don't undertake the task, the world is always going to view them as incompetent anyway. Having the tools, the weapons, and the ability, but choosing inaction just out of fear, to Arjuna, that is hands down the single greatest failure a leader can make.
He concludes his whole argument by bringing it right back to Yudhishthira's initial desire. And he uses this really striking analogy. He says, just as munis, sages who are desirous of achieving tranquility, obtain their simple yellow robes with supreme ease, well, if they simply execute their duty and vanquish the foe, the imperial dignity will just as easily be theirs. The reward naturally follows the focused exertion of valor.
Which leaves us with a final, really provocative thought to ponder today. Yudhishthira, he saw action as a terrible risk to the ones he loved most. But Arjuna saw inaction as a complete betrayal of their very nature and their capabilities. So when you have the competence to stop a cruel purpose, does caution just become an excuse for failure? Is inaction in the face of cruelty simply another form of incompetence?